Hello everyone. Welcome to the last set of sessions for this MAAM conference. I'm Julia Grasso, I'm one of the members of the board, and I just wanted to say thank you all for your attendance, and if you have any feedback, other board members are among you. Just try to find us. But I want to welcome you also to this session on, reimagining the experience XR-powered museum education in the era of the Metaverse. And welcome our presenters, William Zhou, Museum Education Researcher at the George Washington University, and Lexi Cleveland, Technology Executive and Public Historian at ARtGlass. Did I say that right? Okay. So let's give them a warm welcome, and I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thank you very much. So hi everybody, welcome to our session. I believe this is one of the last sessions during this entire meeting. So I hope everyone had a great time in the past 2 days. So it is our greatest pleasure and honor to present our works on museums and technologies today. So let's first get to introduce ourselves. My name is William Zhou. I am a museum educator at the George Washington University. I'm also pursuing my Doctor of Education degree there. I am a core member of the Informal Learning in the Arts team. I'm an artist, I'm an educator, I'm a researcher, and I primarily focus on museum education and how people learn in the museum. And it's my greatest honor to have Lexi here.
All right, thank you, William. Howdy, everybody. My name is Lexi Cleveland. I am the Executive Vice President of ARtGlass, which is the world's leader in wearable augmented reality technology for cultural sites and attractions. I am simultaneously a technologist, so I work with things like smart glasses and AR, as well as a public historian. And my history work focuses on the enslaved community historically in Virginia and the descendant communities that are still around today. And so I really like applying this new technology to telling the stories of my ancestors and kind of bringing stories that have long been, hidden, suppressed to the forward. So that's me.
Thank you. Great. So before we go into today's discussion, I want to first talk a little bit about our topic today. And it begins with actually two simple questions. First, what exactly is XR in the era of Metaverse? And the second one is, as museum professionals, why do we need to care about it? So I will quickly answer the first question of what it is to begin the session. And then I hope everyone will find their answer of why do we care at the end of this session. So Metaverse is a cutting edge and a trendy idea today. It is a concept that we can create a virtual environment for people that can connect with each other and live their life under a virtual avatar. So it first appeared in a science fiction novel in the 90s, and it was famously reintroduced by Mark Zuckerberg last year to the public when he renamed his company from Facebook to Meta. But it might seem surprising to many that educators in their field of study have studied Metaverse in the early 2000s. So what they did was quite different from our approaches today. They actually work on multiplayer online video games like Second Life and World of Warcraft, those games in the early 2000s. And they use these multiplayer online games to study how people can actually connect, interact, and then learn in a virtual environment. So it's quite important to remember that Metaverse is a concept. It's not a specific technology. And currently, XR, extended reality, is the most mature and common technology that people approach this practice. So the purpose of this panel is to talk about XR in museum education and in general museums, and also cultural sites. In speaking of XR, that includes actually two parts. Usually one is AR, one is VR, and Lexi worked extensively on AR. So would you mind giving us a bit more information and insights on this topic?
Yeah, of course. So I always like to ask the audience, does anybody know what virtual reality is? All right, so we have some head nods, yeah. All right. Does anybody care to define it? It's not a trick question. It's all right. You can take a guess. There's like no wrong answers here.
When you go into the holodeck.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So exactly. See, he was brave. So exactly. So virtual reality is a fully virtual creation. So that's, something like you create a virtual scene that you're in. It's almost video game-like. As for augmented reality, you guys might be a little less familiar with that because I think it's slightly more emerging than VR. Augmented reality is the virtual overlaying of the real world. So virtual reality, fully virtual world. Augmented reality is virtual overlaying of the real world. And I brought a VR headset and an AR headset to kind of show you what that means. So this is an Oculus. This is VR. So what do you guys notice about this headset?
Just the eyes.
Yeah, so it's you can't really see much. It's like, yeah, you can't see anything. It's essentially a solid piece of plastic. How about this headset? So this is an augmented reality headset. What do you see? How are those different?
You look through it.
Exactly, you can look through it. So just to kind of physically illustrate the point I'm trying to make, virtual reality, virtual. So if you were using this in a museum, you'd be in some type of virtual setting, you couldn't actually see the things around you. With augmented reality, you're still perfectly capable of seeing, the real objects and real spaces that are before you. And so I work with augmented reality. I think virtual reality has its uses because you can use virtual reality to say, digitize your space so people can look at that from their living room. And I think that has value. But for me, I personally really like location-based education. So getting people to go to the real sites, the real places where things happen, and then giving them additional information while they're there in that physical space. Because I think that place has power. I think, landscapes bear witness to important events, and you can't really replicate that from your living room. To really experience that, you need to be in the site where things happened. But AR allows you to add in additional context so you can better understand, the events or objects that you're looking at. So that would be the main difference between VR and AR. One is virtual, and one is kind of a blending of the virtual and the real.
Thank you. So before Lexi presents more of her fascinating works at ARtGlass, I would like to first provide a bit background on XR in museums. So as a member of the Informal Learning in the Arts team at GW, I focus on how people learn in the museum. And my initial motivation for conducting this panel was from a unpublished article of mine. And that was a literature review of extended reality in museum education. So I investigated data in the last 12 years, which covers 128 peer-reviewed journal articles. And here is a visualization of the studies. And of all these studies, each color and each year represents how many years, how many studies were conducted in that specific year. So I think it demonstrates the trend of research interests in virtual and augmented reality in museum education. So in the first 10 years, there was an increasing trend, and you can see the number falls a bit in 2020 because of COVID and because AR, for example, it's largely physical environments related, and that was not actually happening during the COVID. And also, academic publishing takes time, so we will probably see more and more VR projects that conducted during the pandemic to be published recently in the future. And I want to bring up the framework that, I need to reconnect. Okay, great. So I want to bring up this framework that I use in my literature review studies. As an educator, I deeply care about how education functions what's the educational value? Let's put it this way, what's the educational value of XR? And my question is, does educational theory or framework that traditionally worked in the physical museum still help us to know about learning in the XR environment. So that's why I pick up this very classic contextual model of learning from Falk and Dereking, who are leading scholars in the field of museum visiting experience. And it's a profound framework that has been proving its usefulness for a pretty long time. I think this framework, this model was first developed in the 90s, and they keep polishing it. The latest version they're having right now is from 2018. And it was a very interesting journey for me to look through all the 128 studies through the lenses of these three dimensions: the personal, sociocultural, and physical. The reason why I really like it is because it shows complexity, which I believe why this study is quite important, because it's not just telling us it's good or it's not good. It's not just advocating a new technology. It actually shows a comprehensive image of XR in museum. So that would really help museum workers as well as visitors. So I would like to first present some key findings in this research within bullet points. So the first dimension is physical context. So this is based on a notion that personal history that visitors carries with them into a learning situation is a huge important context. So this is driven from a constructivist perspective that one's learning is influenced by their prior knowledge or experience in this space. For example, if it's a museum learning experience, then it's depending on their prior knowledge on museum objects and their previous experience in the museum. So then I had two bullet points. And the first point I want to bring up is the troubleshoot this. I guess I should touch the cable. The first point I want to bring up is fun versus distraction. So I think most of us might agree that XR is fun and playful, and many study actually shows that visitors, when they find it fun and interesting in XR program, then their learning will be better. They can understand things easier. They will have better engagement. And on the other hand, it was brought to some researchers' attention that once the medium overshadows the content, it might be a distraction. So I think for exhibition designers and educators, it's a meaningful question to ask: how do we still prioritize our museum contents while we are using these cutting-edge technologies? So it also really relates to the personal history of visitors. For example, if we're holding a XR art exhibition, then an art historian who has expertise in painting probably will have a very different reaction compared to, for example, a teenager who has spent a lot of time on Roblox. Both of them having great expertise. One is on technology, one is on the content, but they will have different reactions. And so since it's really depending on the personal history and how the design of the XR is also really matters here. So the second point I want to bring up is about the user-friendly UX strategies. So a weak or a not so strong user-friendly, a weak user interface will probably cause the audience to be disoriented or anxious or overwhelmed, while a strong one might eliminate these feelings of uncomfortableness and can help them to promote their feeling of how to interact with the content as well as their personal history. So therefore, I believe the takeaway here is, although XR is quite different thing from what we have worked previously within the physical museum, but it really cannot alter all the hard works of tutorial jobs as well as educational works. So this is the first point, and I I want to move on to the next point of sociocultural context. This is based on the notion that we human beings are social creatures, and our learning is situated in social settings. So the learning experience in a museum is usually affected by how people interact or collaborate with others. And other individuals might include people from their own social group. For example, if I go to a museum with my cousin, then the person will be my cousin. Or it could be people from the outside of the social group. It could be docents, it could be guides, or even strangers from other social groups. And among these 128 studies, I think it's quite interesting that some of them brought up a point that XR technology actually breaks some old social norms and establish new social norms. It's kind of similar to what we are seeing in the past 2 years on Zoom. Like Zoom meeting actually brings up new social norms of us in school or in workplace. And it's not simply a better or worse thing. It's not simply an improvement or impairment of our current experience. It's simply different. It might limit the interaction between people because when you are presented with all these fascinating contents on your devices, then you're probably not going to spend too much time talking to the friend you go with. But it might also probably opens up many new opportunities and some new ways of interactions that even beyond the current imagination. So this is also associated with what I call beyond brick and mortar, because in this situation, then somebody's experience of interaction is not limited to whoever is going with them at that moment. They can talk to a virtual guide, they can talk to people who is probably thousands of miles away from them. So I believe that's an interesting point because it liberates the audience and somehow separates the museum experience from the institution of the museum itself to some degree, not entirely. And it could potentially in the future become a very empowering thing. And the last aspect I want to talk about is physical context. Usually, or in most cases, our museum experience happens in a physical environment. Even if we were talking about VR or AR, when it's a virtual or partially virtual experience, we're still learning in the surrounding, no matter what the surrounding might look like. And XR, I do have 2 bullet points here, can do very interesting things as they make the impossible possible. A case study in Science Museum shows that people can use XR to demonstrate invisible things, such as it can show the internal structure of a volcano within first-person perspective, which was quite informative and educational. And I believe actually ARtGlass has some projects. For example, I remember we have fascinating projects in Italy, Pompeii, how you reconstruct the city, and that's a great example in Pompeii. We can later do something kind of like that. And before I pass my mic to Lexi, I want to make the last point, which is the free choice versus pre-decided aspect. So what's so great about going to a museum? Partially it's because it gives us free choice. When a visitor going in the museum, you get the right to decide what's the order you look at objects. You get to decide when you look at an object, what details do you want to see and how you want to see it. And many times you can see things that a curator or educator did not really intend to kind of put on this specific project or program, but you can see it itself because it's kind of related to your own background. But I worry that in a situation, for example, like a VR, when everything is constructed and coded by the developer before your visits, then it might impair the free choice learning in the museum space. And certainly this is just about VR because everything in VR is virtually constructed. In AR, it's probably a different case. So I would love to hear your thoughts, and I would just pass that to you.
All right, thank you, William. So just to reintroduce ARtGlass a little bit, so as I mentioned, we are the world's leader in wearable augmented reality for cultural sites. So we've been around for about 7 years now, have launched over 100 deployments globally, have millions of customers. So I think what'll make my part of the presentation a little different from William's is, mine is coming from really applied in the field learning. So launching everything from, like he mentioned, ancient Pompeii to aquariums to Madame Tussauds wax museums. It's really kind of been all over the place as we're doing this journey. And I think you get a really different perspective for the technology when instead of, kind of dealing in theoreticals, you have to make things work in real places for real projects. So that's what I've been doing for about 7 years at this point. And just to kind of talk about why I decided to get into the field in the first place, as I mentioned, in addition to being a technologist, I'm also a public historian. And so what really attracted me to this emerging technology was its ability to tell underrepresented stories, so tell stories that previously weren't really being put, at the forefront. So what you're seeing in this picture, I guess maybe some of you guys recognize this site. It's not too far from here. So Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is one of the plantations we've done projects for, as well as James Monroe's Highland. And of course you go to a site like Mount Vernon, it's absolutely beautiful, but because that landscape is so beautiful, it also hides the fact that at one point this was a forced labor camp. So using augmented reality allows you to put context back on the landscape where otherwise you might not be able to see it. So for this project, we took all of Mount Vernon's research, we worked closely with them, and we were able to, hire actors, so character actors, a lot of them from Colonial Williamsburg, to, depict the lives of enslaved people from Mount Vernon, to be able to put them back in the landscape, giving them voices, allowing them to talk about what their experience in the space was like. So in addition to being able to have, a more complex narrative, also we had 3D model reconstructions of how the house, evolved over time, because what you're seeing now isn't what this site always looked like. So augmented reality allows you to, tell more complex narratives, more honest stories, all on top of a landscape that otherwise, might be missing that context. And I think because I've dealt with so many projects that deal with serious topics like slavery, I also realized that, AR is not a novelty. And I think that's one of the concerns that some museums can have, like, well, is this a gimmick? Is this an appropriate medium to use when I'm trying to tell serious stories? And based on the projects that I've done, once again, these are not theoretical, these are real world projects. Yes, it's a medium, so it's just like any other tool. And if you want to use it to tell serious stories, you absolutely can. Another project I love to talk about is our Monument Avenue tour. We're not too far from Monument Avenue. Does everybody know what Monument Avenue is? All right, I see some people's heads nodding, maybe some people not so much. So just to provide a little bit of context, Monument Avenue is a large street in Richmond, Virginia. Yep, that one. That was, up until quite recently, filled with colossal statues to the Confederacy. So, Robert E. Lee, Jeff Stewart, all the usual suspects. And I'm from Richmond, my whole family is, and during 2020, in addition to protesting, I was also just hearing a lot of very bad history on the streets. So it's one of those moments you put on your public historian hat, you're like, okay, a lot of people are confused. Why are people protesting? Why are people mad at inanimate objects? People were clearly missing some context around, these giant objects that a lot of people were very mad about. So I created a tour, so it's an 1.5 to 3 hour long walking tour, depending on how chatty the group is. And using augmented reality, I am able to put up primary source documents, go through journals, go through speeches, put up archival photographs, transport people back into Richmond after it burns down after the Civil War, in 360 panorama so they can see what the city looked like. So using this technology, I'm able to add documents right before people when we're actually in the real world spaces. So it's almost like a view back into the past. But more importantly, as you can see in this photo, we're doing this as a group tour. So we're doing this together. So we're having a dialogue. So as we go from stop to stop, learning about white supremacy, learning about the Confederacy, learning about lost cause, ideology, we can actually stop and talk and debate about it. So I don't want you to think that augmented reality is a replacement for anything you're doing. No, it can just, as the name implies, augment it. It can enhance it. So you can absolutely use this new technology with more traditional forms of touring, such as narration and dialogue. And all it does is make it more powerful. So you don't have to replace what you're already doing. And I think what's also really special about tours like this, and augmented reality in general, is the power to have unauthorized narratives. So because augmented reality doesn't leave any trace on the landscape, if there is an official narrative that you're trying to challenge, you can do that and nobody can stop you because you don't need to put down anything physical. They can't take it away from you. So I think increasingly we'll see a lot more, kind of guerrilla style AR tours where you are challenging the official narrative, whether that's in a museum space, whether that's on the cityscape, because it's virtual and nobody can take that from you. And what you're also seeing on the screen are just, after every tour we do, post-tour surveys. So we ask people, what did you learn? Like, did this change your views at all? And so as you can see, people are saying, well, we learned more about the social injustice, feeling the anger against the monuments. And that's the point of this, because there are a lot of people who are just genuinely confused. They're like, well, we don't get it, what's going on? So by having an active dialogue, allowing people to push back against what I'm saying, showing them documents is like, don't believe me, here goes a speech from, Jefferson Davis, you don't have to take my word for it. He's saying exactly why he's doing what he's doing. It allowed people to kind of dig into those documents, talk about them, and then come out of the other side more informed about what's going on around them. And this video is just an excerpt from the tour. So this is shot from my iPhone. So we have this on glasses, but you can also do this on your cell phone if you want. And so this is also just telling people about, we use this for the section about Reconstruction. So just talking about John Mercer Langston, so that's Virginia's first Black congressperson. And as we're going through this scene, so you can see it's a 360, so they can see all around them. We even talk about modern politics because he's the first and he's the last for a very long time. So, talking about things like how do voting rights get, destroyed over time. So it's a very active tour that's very relevant to what people are experiencing and allows for a lot of dialogue. This is also just another screen recording from this tour. So for this section, I ask people about their education. So, ask them where are you from? And when you were learning about the Civil War, what name did you hear? How did people label it? So it leads to this group discussion where you get all sorts of different people. Well, yeah, I heard the war, of Northern aggression. I heard the Civil War. And then comparing where you're from and kind of what terms you're learning. So AR is a very powerful tool for leading discussions. Here's just a scene in front of one of the former monuments. So, just kind of really talking about, being able to show people, original advertisements to show restrictions that are explicitly racist, saying, no, if you're African American, you cannot live in this neighborhood. So being able to use those primary source documents to really ground people and say, this is not opinion, these are actual documents, read these for yourself to help you contextualize the space that you're standing in. And then for the last thing I want to talk about is just kind of accessibility and engagement. Augmented reality is a really great tool for making things more accessible. What you're looking at here is actually an aquarium, so not everything's always doom and gloom with my job. So this is Sea Life Charlotte Concord, and for this experience, we actually have glasses and tablets, and so it just teaches people more about the fish that they're seeing. And it's been a really powerful experience because at this site in particular, a lot of people, after we did the post-tour surveys, were saying, well, I've been here a lot, I usually just pass by the tanks, and I never really actually stopped to, look at the fish. And it's oh, well, now I learned this fish has a name. I learned about this fish's actual diet. I learned how to engage. And so it really helps accessibility when you're allowing people to learn in different ways. So ways that, previously, maybe they're not going to read a text next to something, but if you make it gamified, you give it narration, you make it fun, it allows them to engage and learn in a way that otherwise they might not otherwise do. But then also in a very practical sense, you can use augmented reality for captioning, for subtitling, so you can have multiple languages, and then also very literally opening up spaces that people otherwise can't access. So, say that there's something that's deep in the woods that you want to show people that's relevant to your site. In AR, you can recreate that so they can see it, or a room that you're not able to open. So AR is a very powerful tool in terms of accessibility for captioning and subtitling, as well as serving people with different learning needs. And also kind of in a practical sense, so that's the Electro the Common Core, that's a counting game. In a practical sense, there's also accessibility of the technology itself. So that's one of the things that I really like about my job is we built a platform. So kind of over the course of the pandemic, we really focused on changing to like a software as a service model. Because previous to that, we were making all the tours using our own internal tool. So now we've kind of simplified things, really oriented it for cultural site staff to be able to use. And so that way, without needing to code, without needing to know how to animate, people can instantaneously create and publish their own augmented reality tours. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of a constant concern when you have emerging technologies. A lot of the times it's not very accessible to most people because you need to have specialized equipment or specialized knowledge to use it. So making a really user-friendly platform is one of the ways we wanted to approach making sure that all sorts of people can actually access an emerging technology. Well, I'm going to pass it back over to William.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned this tour builder software you can work it yourself. It reminds me how maybe 10 years ago when people want to build their personal sites, you got to use websites like WordPress.com. And right now you have Wix.com or Squarespace, all these self-service websites. That makes things a little bit easier. So I think that's definitely a great thing. So before we further having more discussions, I think we can talk about the takeaways, and I will talk about the takeaways, the first three. So like Lexi just mentioned about novelty. So XR in a museum is really not just about being a new technology, just not about being the novel thing, because education takes time. The museum is the institution that always teaches us the power of time. So it's not about chasing the novel technology, but really what's great about it is the effort that we put on towards the visitors. So the second thing about evaluate the teaching and learning, and that was also resonate with what you just introduced, the survey we had at the end of your tour. So I think it's quite important because informal learning in the art museums or in the museums or in general, informal learning is really hard to measure, especially if you want to take it from a quantitative method. There's no scorings, there's no testings, nor that we necessarily need them. But on the other hand, I think we all realize that we need to have some evidence of learning because establishing an AR or VR program is it's a big thing. It's an institutional decision. We need to convince people that this is helpful. So if we need to invest our time and efforts and money into this program, then it's important to have evidence, and these evidence will emerge from evaluations, and it depends on what kind of evaluations we will do. And lastly, I think, like you said, enhancement rather than replacement. So XR is not a replacement of our current practice. AR is a great example about how the technology can enhance our current environment. It's largely based on the physical environment. And you might say maybe VR is a bit different because it does not require you to be at a museum. During the COVID, it became a very interesting alternative solutions when museums are not open. But if we look at it from a larger perspective, not just one visit, from a longer period of time, from how people, in terms of human development, experience museum through their life, then that would be a very interesting enhancement to their overall experience. So it provides a new way of perceiving what we had, and that's why I believe it's very important that we encounter these technologies.
Thank you, William. And for the 2 points I want to bring up, so once again, just going back to that point on accessibility, technology is a really great way of having more experiences on your site that can serve more people who have different types of needs. Especially because if you're using even something like a tablet, you're able to store multiple tours on one device, or you can even use a bring your own device option. So it just kind of allows you to serve different clients who have different needs. And also working with diverse communities. So once again, I think this is my favorite part of the technology, is being able to really empower people to tell stories, layer over their own stories, over what can be an official but maybe not necessarily accurate narrative. So I think that's really my favorite part, is it allows you to really challenge narratives even in their own space. So you can have an unofficial tour of a site if you disagree with what they're saying.
Great. So before we talk about future trends and more conversations about how you view it, is it okay if you do a demonstration of the software as the tool builder, and so we can have a clear picture of what we are talking about? Because ARtGlass is a technology provider that works on both software and hardware, and we bring them here today. So if it's okay, could you?
Yeah, happy to. All right, so let me pop out of this for a second. At least attempt to. All right. So some of you guys were in earlier, so you saw us playing around. So this is Tour Builder. As the name implies, you build tours or other experiences. It doesn't have to be a linear tour. So it's a really easy platform, no coding required. So think of it as pretty drag and drop. So you can layer on, like audio, footage, photos, 3D models, and build out a scene. So this is from a tour we have in Norway. So you have a Viking guide, he's telling you about like the kings of Norway. So you can do everything from light VR. So this is a full 360 scene. As you can see, you can, look all around you. To even things that are more transparent. So everything that's gray here in the real world, that's see-through. And I think one of the other things that makes the system really cool is instantaneous publishing. You don't only have to use things like smart glasses, you can use tablets, phones, and we even have a no-download web app. So literally you build it here, you publish it, it pops up a QR code, and you can scan that QR code on any phone and immediately play the tour you just made. So it's really convenient. So here's just some of the different types of tours you can make. So GPS tours are for things like city walking tours. So content triggers based on GPS coordinates. So you put in your longitude and latitude, designate a range. So, say if we're talking about DC, we're talking the Washington Monument or something, find the longitude and latitude for that. Say, I want content to trigger once people are within 20 meters of it. So then, once somebody's within 20 meters, content starts that you dictate. Next to that, we have guided tours. So that would be like Pompeii or the Monument Avenue tour, where content is triggered by a live tour guide who's with their group. So it's virtual beacons that are in your phone. You press a beacon once you're in front of, say the Jeb Stuart statue, and then that corresponding scene starts on whatever fleet of hardware you have. And then we have self-guided, which is versatile. So this is meant for, like autonomous, self-guided experiences. And we won't get too deep into the triggers, but you have all sorts of different ways to trigger stuff. So everything from like menus, which you can use for things like quizzes, or once again, kind of autonomous things where people can choose like what they want to experience. Markers, which is object recognition. So you look at a painting, then the corresponding scene for that painting starts. Instant tracking, so that's surface detection, put something on a sidewalk or a table. So a lot of different tools within it. And then this is just a QR code, so if you guys wanted to scan that, you could and do stuff on your phone. So yep, that's Tour Builder.
So if someone, for example, our organization, they said we do not have the budget to invest in the device, then they can just use the QR code, develop the software side, and people can scan.
Exactly, yeah. So the web app's really great for the bring your own device. So, say you don't have a budget for hardware, people can just use their cell phones, the ones they walk in the door with.
And also I have a question. Can you go back to the second
Second
page?
one, yeah.
So who creates these images? Like as you said, it's self-oriented software,
Yeah.
and if I have no background in doing so, like where does these images come from?
Yeah, so you can use what you already have in like your own collection and archive. So even if you're just using things like photos or footage, you can make that really dynamic because, say you can arrange them in a 360 gallery. All you have to do is upload your images and then just kind of move them around. For things that are, maybe slightly more advanced, even just, going onto a stock website and getting some stock templates, so make some stock, videos with some cool effects. So even if you have no like graphic design background or anything, there's actually a lot of really budget-friendly ways to make some pretty convincing content.
So that's really cool.
Thank you, William.
Yeah. So we can probably just leave the QR code here in case people want to scan it. And when you scan it, it has sounds, right?
It does, yeah. So it might get a
so
little
it
loud
might be a
for
little
everything
bit
at the
too
same
loud.
time,
Yeah,
but
but that's all right. So actually I have a few questions about like you and also the technologies that we're working on. So you have been working in this field for 7 years. So I imagine in 2016, 2015, AR was quite different from what it is in 2022. Is there any changes, are there any changes that you observe and experience in the last 7 years that you're in this industry? And if so, what are these things?
yeah, absolutely. So technology changes and it changes rapidly. So I'd say when I first started, even the software could be unreliable because at that point the software was essentially, just kind of tested in a lab. It hadn't actually been field tested yet. And definitely the things you're testing in a lab and the things you're testing once you're in like real world places with real world conditions are completely different things. So the software's gotten a lot better because of all the projects we've launched. So you get into different scenarios and you're like, well, how are the software and hardware playing when I'm like ankle deep in snow, like, on the side of a mountain or in the middle of like 113 degree, heat. So kind of all those different real world learnings from real world scenarios, allows us to kind of like change and refine the software for what our real world, conditions are. So the software is a lot more reliable. It can handle a lot more things. Even for the hardware gets lighter over time, more reliable, longer battery life, better sensors. So I think overall, both hardware and software have kind of advanced due to actually being used in the field and taking those learnings and refining.
And speaking of hardware, so does museum usually get their own device or they rent it from you, or how does this work?
Yeah, so in terms of hardware, museums get their own devices. And these days, there's just so many options on the market. So that's another big difference between, like 2016 and now. Back then, you maybe had the option of like 2 headsets, and now there's probably a new headset coming out like, every month. And the prices are also dropping now, so headsets are a lot more accessible these days as well in terms of price point. But you don't have to just use, so these are kind of the cutting edge. Wearables are really cool, but you can also do a lot of really cool AR stuff on cell phones, on tablets. So in terms of hardware, it's the choice of the site, but we are also happy to advise, kind of based on what your learning outcomes are, like what's the best piece of hardware for you, for your particular use case.
And I'm thinking in the future, so we were talking about the future perspective, probably should go back to that page. And what are some of the future things you see that might happen in this field of either we're talking about specifically AR or XR or even, Metaverse, if you'd like to?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest trends we're seeing is just that it's a lot more mainstream now. So yeah, even like 6-7 years ago, that was still, it still is pretty cutting edge, but the people who were entering into this field at that point were the people who were really daring and were willing to put their sights through kind of the unknown. So I say after, 6-7 years, it's a lot less of an unknown, so people are a lot more comfortable with the technology. So I think you're probably going to see a lot more AR tours, possibly to the point of replacing a lot of audio tours. So not necessarily like wearables, but even just on cell phones. I think things are kind of heading that direction. In terms of the industry at large, the technology itself is just advancing. In particular, a lot of companies right now are working on kind of like shared AR experiences. So, you could be wearing a headset, somebody else in your party is wearing a headset, and you're able to see and manipulate, the same object at the same time. So that's one of the things that's currently kind of in the pipeline is like more group shared like interactivity.
This shared AR idea is somehow Metaverse to me because there is a world that you can interact in. Yeah. And what interests me the most is when you talk about the giving people the access and help marginalized people or help people who used to probably did not have the resources to get into a museum or get into the technology to have their experience. I think that's what I'm really interested in.
Thank you, and I agree because, obviously, like as a historian, like narrative is very important. Who controls narratives is important. So I think that's always been kind of one of my concerns for this technology is, well, if it's too expensive, if it's not accessible, only certain narratives are getting told because those are the only people who can access this. So at least for my career, it's always been kind of making sure that this technology is accessible so that it's not just kind of the people who can afford, emerging technology are able to use this technology to tell stories. So I think that probably is like something to be kind of excited about, at least for the US side of things. The first ever wearable, AR tour was at James Monroe's Highlands. So it's a plantation, talking about real history. So, I'm glad that kind of gets the honor of being the first wearable tour in the US is something that's actually focusing on that type of history as opposed to something else.
And for museums, if they are thinking about establish an XR program, is there anything you think they should consider, like if they first look at themselves, what they have, and how to kind of kickstart it?
Yeah, so I'd say I'd always start with kind of evaluating what you feel like your narrative gaps are. So are there stories that you aren't telling that you think you should be telling? And then you can explore whether or not, augmented reality or virtual reality is the right medium for that. But at the end of the day, these are tools. So I say start with what you're trying to achieve, and then you can find the right tool for that.
So that's great. So I think we should leave some time for both the Q&A session as well as you can see, we bring a bunch of devices here. So we wanted that we all had some time to try them out. So I think it's a good time that we start the Q&A.
Yeah.
And if everybody, these are the contact information of us. If you have a question afterwards, you can always give us an email. But is there any questions you would like to ask? And yes.
You touched upon this a little bit, but kind of a super practical question. What would you say, for an average museum to do a project like this? How much would it cost, and then how much time would it take? How big is it? A 3-month project with 8 people? Is it 2 people for kind of? What would it take to implement this?
Yeah, so I'd say it varies by product. I think 6 months is you can get a really over the top tour, but you can do 3 months if it's something that's not super high production value. So yeah, it really kind of depends on what content you're putting in. So if you're saying, I want green screen characters of historical figures, you have to find a green screen studio. You have to hire actors. You have to process that footage. But if you want to start with something hey, we already have a bunch of scans of historical documents. We want to put some documents up and have some narration. You can knock that out in a month or 2. I guess in terms of pricing for our software, it starts at $2,500 a month, up to $5,000 a month or so. But we're also really flexible because we want to work with people. So yeah, for access to the platform, it's $2,500 a month. But in terms of production, you can really put as much or as little into production as you want. So even if I'm using the Monument Avenue tour as an example, That's a really long tour. Yeah, it's like, what's it, an hour and a half long tour. But I only spent $75 in terms of production because I had to license one video, but otherwise it was all archival materials because it's, really drawing from like historical speeches and documents. So you can spend as much or as little as you want on production.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So, just to make sure I understand this, is that each AR experience is sort of custom built for a space or a place. So like for the monument tour, you had to go out and you had to find the picture of the Confederate general and put it back on the base that was already there. And then if you were in a museum and there was a painting, you could augment whatever would be in written or in an audio tour with maybe pictures of the painter's house or the painting in progress or a little video or something. While you're looking at the object, you get another level or two of information. Is that kind of what's going on?
That's exactly what's going on. So AR is contextual because you're supposed to be looking at that real object. You're supposed to be in that real location, and then you're digitally enhancing, digitally augmenting to put in the additional context. So something like, oh, here's a photo of the artist's house next to his painting. Here goes related works that are maybe in other institutions, so you can actually see them next to each other now using the augmented reality. So it's contextual.
And is any of it triggered by the object itself? Like if I looked at the Gauguin, it would know that was Gauguin, and it would start telling me about
Exactly.
it.
Yeah. So that would be. I think I took you guys through the markers. So there's all sorts of different ways to trigger content. So you could use GPS coordinates, or for something like that, that would be a marker, which is object recognition. So you would take a photo of the actual painting you're trying to augment, and then you would upload that into the system. So then whether or not you're using a phone or a tablet, smart glasses, once it looks at that, it's like, oh, I recognize that piece, and then plays the corresponding part. So exactly.
First of all, thank you. This has been so awesome to listen to and hear. One of my question is in terms of walking tours. I think that what you did for the monument tour is so cool, and I'm curious about in terms of distance. Like, are there limitations, or is it something that you can kind of like? If I'm a DC museum that wants to, mark all these different monuments that are related, I can just go in, geotag each one, and, whoever later on, they can do their own kind of self-guided walking tour. Is that kind of?
That's correct.
Awesome?
Yeah.
It doesn't,
No, yeah, so once again, there's kind of different techniques you can use. So in terms of, I guess we call them location markers, there's actually 3 different modes for that.
Okay, yeah, that's, I guess, the crux one.
Exactly, yeah, so there's 3 different ways you can do it. So it's one is GPS coordinates. So once again, if you were doing a monument or something, you take the longitude and latitude for each individual site you're trying to trigger, and then set the range. So even on a self-guided tour, you would just put up a map or something, some wayfinding information to be walk to, the Washington Monument. Then when they get there, the content would start. And then you could have, here goes your map again, walk to, the Martin Luther King Monument. So having them go, and then it triggers for each different stop. Mm-hmm. Or you can have the guided tour where all the beacons live in somebody's phone, so it's triggered by the tour guide. Or you can have physical beacons, which are just the little puck things that you can hide in a tree or hide under a door. So so you can have 3 different options for a location mode. Thank you.
How do you navigate certain intellectual property issues? Right.
I think that's probably one of the most pressing issues for the field. So at least for us, we just do a lot of research, and it'll be interesting to see what happens now that we have opened up this platform for other people to be able to use. So at least for what I do, is not usually much of an issue because it's a lot of archival materials. But IP is definitely a big issue in the field because a lot of people don't realize, no, you can't just go on Google and grab a random image and throw that in your tour. That's illegal. So I think we're going to kind of have to cross that bridge when we get there, now that we do have people who are not us using our system.
question. So, if I can kind of visualize this room, say in the AR, does it involve some measurements or some field works that I need to do just to precisely record this room, or is that something I can do myself?
Yeah, so no, it's not even that complicated really. So I guess for this room, there's not really a whole lot going on in it, but if you were just trying to do something like, oh, I want to put something on the table, that would just be an instant tracking node, and so that just does it on its own. You don't need to scan anything for that. Yes, if it's, like once again, like a physical marker, like a painting, because you need the actual image of that painting so the device can recognize it. And then otherwise, you can also just use compass directions. So especially if you're on a landscape, there's nothing to actually like mark to, trigger. So you would just take a compass, go where you want to go, and say like, oh, okay, this is at 30 degrees, and then you just put in 30 degrees, and the system shifts it. So yeah, so you can use compass directions, like a surface detection or like a visual marker.
Does this live somewhere? Like, is it someplace on a server, or is it just like, and is that the museums, or is that yours?
That's ours. Yeah, so you guys wouldn't have to worry about anything like that.
Any other questions about devices or software or even evaluations or all these things?
How's the feedback been from your clients?
They love it. So, especially like at the beginning, it was like sometimes rocky, but that was also the people who were willing to experiment because the tech was still kind of in its infancy at that point. But yeah, no, clients love it. I think there's kind of always an iterative process to it though. So most of the feedback is like, okay guys, like, we've had it in the field for a month. Some people are kind of missing this stuff. Like, what are we going to do to like, readjust it? It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe we just need a different wayfinding thing. Maybe we need to add an additional piece of audio so that they can find this. So it's like kind of a constant iteration because, you put a tour out there and then you put the public in it and then you get their real world feedback. But I think that's the other easy thing is it's easy to iterate because you essentially would just like upload that new audio file, press publish, and now it's updated.
Yeah, and are there easy ways to track data through?
Yeah.
So then you can be like, yeah, I noticed that.
Then everybody's like, nobody's
walking past it.
Exactly.
You can see on the screen.
Like nobody's hitting this trigger. You're like, yeah, it's like, oh no, like maybe we need to make a better marker. So especially if you're doing something like 3D, like a statue or something, you usually want to put like multiple angles of that in because you don't know how people are approaching it. So if consistently it's like, wow, nobody's triggering the statue, maybe we need more photos. So you're kind of like constantly kind of like tweaking and iterating.
Yeah.
After like people get in it and you're getting like real world user feedback on it.
Yeah, and it's not just your company, ARtGlass, like you're able to give these skills to whatever museum,
exactly,
etc. And like you were shown, like, it's relatively easy to fix it yourself. So there's not as much of a, I guess, gap.
Exactly, and that's what because I guess prior to the pandemic, we were doing everything bespoke. So we would, go in, make the tour. I'd, go out to wherever it is this tour is like launching, like actually in the ground, on the field, testing it, doing beta testing. Then the pandemic happened, like every museum like shut down. And that kind of gave us a little bit of like steel time to be like, okay, like what do we want to kind of do as a business? And that's when we were like, let's take, all of these years worth of learnings, reorient our tool instead of being internal, like kind of being, public facing, and how much of what we have learned can we like decant down so it's like easy to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So I mean, when pandemic became a transition point, and so do you still have a lot of facing the public tours as you've demonstrated on Avenue?
Yeah, so Monument Avenue is still going. Let's see, I guess like they might still have another tour this month. So that's through the Valentine Museum. So I was leading it because I originally created it because I also had downtime because everything was shut down and I was like crazy in the streets. So it was like 2020, I was like handling it. And then like the world started to open back up and the tours would literally be booked every time. And so it's just like way too much for me. So although I like love that tour and I love giving that tour, I couldn't keep up with it because like my real job started back up again. So the Valentine History Museum in Richmond took over, and so they give the tour like twice a month. But their walking tour season ends in November, so this would be the last month to do it for this season. But I think they might still have one on the calendar if anybody's like around the Richmond area and wants to do this tour. And right now, Sea Life Charlotte Concord's also up and running. So if you're interested in the aquarium one, that's right in Concord, North Carolina. And then we have several in Europe right now that are running, including Pompeii.
Very cool. So, before we kind of have some time to explore these devices, any questions you'd like to ask?
Already hard. Everybody's so tired. It's that time of day.
Yeah. Any other things?
No, I mean, like, yeah, so we have hardware if you guys want to test stuff.
Yeah, we have headphones, eyeglasses, and
What are they programmed to see?
So, and these ones I have Monument Avenue as well as some of the Sea Life Charlotte Concord stuff. Yeah, any more questions?
All right, thanks again.
All right, thank you.